The dinner tonight is to recognize our donors and our partners who've made it possible for Isfap in its very short period of existence to do all the work that we have done. We have a number of students that are going to be joining us for the dinner, essentially to tell their stories, because it is important that they tell their stories and how they feel the support that they are getting from Isfap is enabling them to achieve their own objectives.
There's a need for about 28 billion rands every year for the missing middle category of students.
And that's why Isfap, Ikusasa Student Financial Aid Scheme, was created to essentially address that need, because we have a number of people who want to have access to higher education, particularly university education, but cannot do so because they don't have the financial means to go to university. And this is where Isfap comes in.
We live in a country where government has done a great deal in providing access to higher education, access to university education.
We can't just leave that responsibility to government to fund those students that are not funded.
What Isfap is trying to do is not only a platform for providing financial aid to the missing middle, it is increasingly becoming a platform where we're dealing with some of these complex issues.
Quite a lot of our children are being inhibited by social factors from them to actually completing their education.
The whole objective is to make sure that students can get to campuses and they have enough food in their stomachs to attend lectures.
The program that is run by Sizwe and the team is characterized, as we know, by this ecosystem of support around students in order to help them not only with their academic work, but also with social dynamics.
We have to make sure that universities are offering degrees that are relevant for where we are in the world of work.
There's a second set of studies that show that of the countries around the world, South Africa provides the biggest return on a degree and a higher education in terms of the amount of income you subsequently earn as a result of that.
Isfap's strategic intent is to ensure that our young people can meaningfully participate in the economy. So we do so by making sure that they are doing and pursuing degrees that are going to lead to employability, that are going to improve their chances of participating in the economy. In other words, playing a role in supporting themselves, their families, and in turn making a positive contribution to society.
As a company, we understand fully that our success and growth is dependent on skills and the knowledge of people.
We ensure that skills development and training is enabled in our sector, whilst supporting and facilitating transformation to the workforce.
We have funded more than 1,600 students to date, and in fact in 2020 we should be increasing that number to just over 2,000 students. We've been operating for just over 4 years. The milestones that have been achieved are really, really great, and it could not have been possible had it not been for the partners that we work with.
Life is, as it is, challenging in every aspect: social, educational, mental.
I was devastated. I was sort of depressed. I lost a lot of weight. It was bad.
My mom is a domestic worker, so she didn't have enough money to pay for my registration.
Even the accommodations were very expensive.
I didn't have the resources, I didn't have laptops, I didn't have money for books.
It's an honor to be one of the recipients of the Isfap Bazaar.
I would like to thank the funders for what they are doing for us.
I got moral support.
So education is really important to me because it has allowed me to change my life and change my family's life.
Whatever I want, whatever I need, it will be there for me.
Because it's honestly a really, really, really good bursary program
to help the people from my community achieve their dreams.
I will actually fund somebody out there, somebody who is in need of funding, just like I did.
We're really all touched with the lovely stories that you all have shared. We really appreciate your stories from your heart. I mean, it's really real life stories, and I think that's really important for not just me but for the funders to hear. And we can't thank them enough for the work that they've done in setting up Isfap and really bringing us where we are today. Good afternoon, attendees. Happy to find all of you here this afternoon, and we find ourselves in this lovely building of Future Africa at the UP campus. And I'm joined by two very lovely panelists. I want to first welcome all the delegates today that have taken the trouble. It is a tough time and a tough year that has gone by, and a busy period for all of us. So really thank you for taking your time out to attend this live dialogue session today. I also want to just state that we have participants from quite a few countries. We have representatives from the public sector, private sector, media, from the universities. There is representation from obviously funders and donors and international funding communities as well. In terms of just setting up introducing myself, I'm Shane Perrier. I'm head of fundraising and strategy, and I represent Isfap here today together with Sizwe. Just in terms of introducing the topics, we are going to talk about funding the missing middle and impact of education in South Africa. I would now like to introduce the two panelists. We have Mr. Sizwe Nxana, who is the chairman of the Isfap Foundation, and also founder of the Siviso Learning Group. And we have Professor Tuana Kupe, who's the Vice Chancellor and Principal of University of Pretoria. Just a quick highlight about Isfap, and that is the things that have happened in the last 18 months. The video that you just saw was a 2019 video, just a couple of months, 2020 video, a couple of weeks before the lockdown. And a lot has changed since then. So just to give you a quick update on Isfap and where we stand, Isfap is registered as a non-profit organization and a public benefit organization. We focus on the missing middle and poor students, and we fund them for their full cost of study. We focus on critical skills. We focus on getting assisting corporates in South Africa to avail of BBBEE points, as well as corporate social responsibility spend. We get funded by top JSE listed companies, international funders, domestic funders, government funders, etc. And we've, over the last 5 years that we've been operational, we've deployed close to R1 billion in funding to over 2,300 students, and we've graduated about 400 plus students from the platform. We've achieved a throughput rate of 85% and above across all of these critical skills, and the critical ingredient of that being the wraparound support that we provide to our students. And that's really a direct correlation to the success and throughput that we have at Isfap. Our founding members include Banking Association of South Africa, Business Leadership South Africa, SAICA, which is South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, the First Rand Foundation, and the CISA, which is Association of Savings and Investments. Thank you, gentlemen, and really appreciate your time. I'm really honored and really privileged to have this webinar with both of you. And I think you're well recognized and respected in the sector, in the education sector, not just in South Africa, but on the African continent globally. So really welcome you both today for this live dialogue. Professor Kupe, if you can give us a few quick highlights about University of Pretoria and where you are today, and just to introduce to our audience about UP.
Well, I think at the University of Pretoria this year we have 56,500 students, so providing access, especially in critical skills needs. So let's say about 50% of our students are enrolled in the science, engineering, and technology degree programs because of the scarce need in South Africa. Then also another group in the financial services, actuarial sciences, data statistics, if you like. Our enrollments are weighed in that direction because that is the need in our country. And that is, by the way, is also where Isfap has helped. Then there's this third group is in the medical sciences, the need for doctors, healthcare workers and all of that. Again, that is in an area where Isfap has helped us, but that's what we're going to talk about today. Last week, we received from the South African Graduate Employers Association the award for the university that best prepares students for the work environment. And I think that is very, very good because, as you know, there has to be a link between the quality of the education you offer and the right areas, and also for students who can actually enter the work environment and begin to be productive and also, to uplift themselves. So we're really very proud of that. And second, we're preparing for next year. We have a very strong online presence. We're one of the 10 universities that last year finished academic year 2020 by supplying laptops to students who didn't have, because we believe in the principle, no student left behind. Even then, we still need quite a lot of support, and we use own resources, schemes like Isfap. We raise money from a lot of companies, including the SETAs. We also raise money internationally through competitive best quality or top student activities, like, say, for example, the MasterCard Foundation.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Kupe. That's really encouraging. Definitely finishing your academic year in record time is definitely an achievement. And I think, given how COVID has impacted all of us, I'm sure that's well received by the student community as well. If I can, thank you for that. If I can go over to Mr. Sizwe and just talk to us through what's happening in the education sector, and especially in the tertiary sector, and what have you seen? I know you've cut across quite a few segments within education, right from ECD to basic education to tertiary education to post-tertiary education. So where do you see the impact of education in the last 3 to 5 years, and where is it going for South Africa in the near future?
I think let's just talk about especially the impact of COVID and what it has done, especially to young people, and what it also has done in terms of increasing the gap between the have-lots and the have-nots. Because clearly the last 2 years or so, since the advent of COVID, we've seen from early childhood development, for instance, a lot of children that are taken out of ECD centers where parents are concerned about especially transmission of COVID to young people. So the system of education has lost a lot of young people. And we know how important education is in the formative years, especially the first 1,000 days. And so we're going to see the impact of that later on in the lives of these children. And the basic education system, if you just look at the whole world, we have more than 1 billion young people who lost opportunities for attending school over the last year. In our own country, in South Africa, we continue, for instance, in basic education to see what is called rotation. In other words, the trimming of curriculum because of the lost days of schooling that continue to happen, because obviously with overcrowding and the number of learners that are catered for in the schooling system means that that system, especially the public education system, cannot handle the number of learners that are in that system. And that has resulted in a significant number of days lost of learning and teaching, of learning losses, because we know typically what happens in practice is that if, for instance, there's only 50% attendance with a trimmed curriculum, the learners lose and forget a lot of the material or content or knowledge that they would have had to gain in a normal setting environment. And all of this is having an impact in terms of success rate, in terms of retention of learners in the system. And unfortunately, it affects the girl child even more, because what we've seen in the last 2 years or so is that, for instance, access to health, access to nutrition, access to sexual health, for girls particularly, has been a big issue. So you've seen a significant increase in pregnancies, as an example, of young girls that are not in schools or that are attending school on a rotation basis. We've seen a significant increase in gender-based violence during this time of COVID. And all of this has a bigger impact on a girl child than it does on boys. Of course, boys have also been impacted adversely by the advent, of COVID. And all of this really just says to all of us, as society, as civil society, as business, the NGO community, the education sector, that we have to work together. No longer can we leave the responsibility of education on government alone. We have to get involved. We have to pool resources so that a lot of young people that are in the early childhood development system, the basic education system, the higher education system, can at least be given hope. Because at the moment, you have a lot of cases of young people who are even resorting to the ultimate of taking their lives because they just feel there's no hope for them. So that's why organizations like Isfap play a really, really important role in not only providing financial aid and support so that young people can have access to education, especially higher education, but that we also bring, to the party a lot of other players who can also make sure that we're providing these opportunities to young people. When you look at universities as an example, in our country, as an example, we still have a huge gap between historically disadvantaged universities, open distance learning institutions that are even more severely impacted by, of course, the fact that we have the unequal distribution of resources. So that's why it is important for different stakeholders to come together so that we can create a brighter future. And in the process, we can grow our economies. Because to the extent that we are seeing, for instance, the losses of gains that have been made over the last couple of years, especially in closing the inequality gap, in closing the poverty gap and the employability gap, we're seeing some of those gains being lost again. So it is important for parties to work together to close these gaps.
Sure. There's so much of stuff that you spoke that I just want to open up, but there's so much of gems that you spoke about. And I think just giving that hope to the young youth in this country is a responsibility for us. And I think that's the most important thing, that they don't lose hope in their life and what they have to achieve and what they have to do in their lives. So thank you, Sizwe, for that. Really appreciate it. If I can, and just taking on from the impact of COVID that you mentioned on not just ECD and basic education, but post-basic education as well. How has COVID impacted the university environment in South Africa, Professor Coupe, and particularly in UP? How has it impacted the lives of students, the teaching methodology and how you actually dissipate knowledge to your learners? And you talked about how you finish it in record year in 2020, which is excellent. So how were you able to achieve that? And what are some of the successes that got you to get there?
Well, to have to go online because of COVID was a at least a double blow. It might be actually much more, as Mr. Ikusasa rightly said. So first, to have to go online for everything, you had to have a teaching and learning management system capable of delivering. Second, the students themselves would have to have digital devices that they could access the teaching and learning and to have data as well. And also to live in an area where there is connectivity and there is electricity. We know, as Ms. Ikusasa just said, we live in an unequal society. That was not true of all of our students. So what we did at UP first was to create a solidarity fund to which every staff member and anyone could donate. Some of our partners in the corporate sector also and the foundations came to our being. We thought then of our 55,000 students. In my head, I thought perhaps 15,000 students didn't have laptops. Turned out it was less, but still it was around 4,000. And repurposing our finances and also donations and our solidarity fund, we had to deliver laptops. Our principle again was no student left behind. In fact, to achieve that, we had to postpone our relaunch after closing on the first lockdown by 2 weeks. We'd intended to open in mid-April. We only opened in May. But we were determined that we would actually not start without anybody behind, given we already live in an unequal society. And also we had very many interesting things happened. Not only that people contributed and we could buy the laptops and deliver them, but you know who we partnered with to deliver the laptops? The post office.
Oh, wow.
People often think the post office is useless. But on this score, the post office delivered perfectly. Where they could not deliver, so for example, with instances interesting, where students returned the laptops because they had found another laptop or something. It was also a loan scheme, by the way. They brought back the laptop. So we never lost a single laptop of the 3,000 or so that we actually sent out. So then we could go. We also had been fortunate that in 2019, as a management team, we decided to upgrade our our IT system by injecting 100 million into the IT system. That proved to be very good because it meant that most students and staff didn't need data to go online. Data, as you know, was the big thing last year.
Yeah.
And affording that data from university coffers strained the finances and also strained family income, some which did not actually exist. We also decided to keep behind some students whose family circumstances are not conducive to learning. So throughout the COVID last year in 2020, there were 300 students still living at university because there is Wi-Fi, there's computer connections. And when the lockdown levels went down, we brought in more of the students living in circumstances where they could not study. Even if we gave them a laptop, there will be no electricity. There will be no connectivity out there in the rural areas or in some of our informal settlements. There were still perhaps 100-odd students who were to send hard copy material. And one of our donors gave us funding to do telephone tutoring. So they were dedicated tutors actually talking to students. HUP also, even today, we do not only record our lectures, do PowerPoints and post them. We run live synchronous lectures. So when the lecture would have been at 8 a.m., you are online at 8 a.m. with a live lecturer at 8 a.m. online. We think that is very, very important because it simulates the environment you would normally have. But the lectures are also posted afterwards and so on. So if you like, we had to be fairly innovative and also both in terms of financing actually the new dispensation and trying to overcome the difficulties posed by COVID, but also in a sense, lecturers had to up their game in online teaching. We are fortunate that even before COVID, we used a hybrid or blended system. Students had to go online before class. Online material might be used during class, a live contact class, and post-class students had to consolidate their knowledge online. So there was a familiarity not usual among both staff and students. But this does not mean it was easy. We also track the system. We still do track. I think once every 2 or 3 months, we actually survey both students and staff to see how the performance and whether people are comfortable, what they are actually doing. We have an analytic system that does that. It's been very amazing for me to see how people have gained confidence in the online space and also where there might be glitches and difficulties. And of course, you got to run the exams online, most of them anyway. So I think we've learned resilience, ability to scale up in difficult conditions, and ability also to be forward-looking and future-oriented.
Yeah, and repurposing your financials to make
so
it work.
One of the things we did, for example, is any staff member, including myself, who needed an upgrade of their laptop that was postponed. The laptops were going to the students.
Okay, that's a good approach. All right, and what percentage of your students are now at campus, and how many of them are off campus? What's that ratio?
No, well, they are not difficult to say. Let me say, plus the raise environment helps. 90% of our resis, we have 29 residencies, about 12,000 beds. 90% is occupied as we speak.
Okay.
But then there are students who do not live in res, who come in for specific contact classes in the appropriate numbers under safety conditions. That differs from day to day, from course to course, and so on. But it's nowhere near what it would be under normal circumstances, right?
Sure.
Because we don't run a large majority of the hourly contact classes that we normally do. People are online, whether they are on campus or live at home or live wherever for that matter. It's not the most ideal situation, but we're managing the situation as best as we can, given this COVID is a global pandemic.
Yeah.
Everybody has had to scurry home or hide somewhere
Yeah.
because you can't do the normal things that you used to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And to see students succeed and get that benefit while studying at the campus, I think is really beneficial. I have some stat which says 48% of students prefer a blended studying model, which is quite high.
Yeah.
I mean, I can imagine that for 52% like the contact and like the relatability. But what you learn on campus is also very different from what you can grasp and learn over a screen, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Education is something that is social. So it cannot be distanced in totality, right? There are things you can learn online. That's what we have learned, that some of the stuff we were doing in contact mode was no longer really necessary given the technological advances. But simply because the technology is there doesn't mean you can do it well. We actually looking into investing in more teaching of people online, studios for producing the materials and all of that. And students also have to learn how to learn online. It's not actually simply, I have the device, we'll learn. It doesn't work like that. Then there are skills and particular skills needed for the future of work in the 21st century, which are very, very important. Some people thought in the old days they were called soft skills. We now discover they are actually hard skills. Critical thinking, critical analysis, learning to engage, learning to collaborate, appreciating different forms of diversity, diverse cultural diversity, geographic diversity, regional diversities, because now the world is so interconnected. And also you will not occupy one career in your lifetime, to be multiple careers requiring you to learn how to learn, to unlearn and to relearn. So lifelong learning is going to be very important. And that personal engagement, contact engagement, is key for many careers going forward, including those careers we discover will emerge as the rapidly advancing technologies do. Just last night here, in this very space, we launched we had a pre-launch lecture for the Center for the Future of Work. And on these boards that you see now, they were robots. And at the University of Pretoria, we now have 3 robot employees. The one is still waiting for some software from China because of these supply chain breakdowns because of COVID. He is going, well, no, I think they said it will be gender neutral. Is going to be working with our engineers to do road testing. The one, Stevie, named after Steve Biko at our Steve Biko Hospital, works with doctors in Germany and Steve Biko to diagnose patients on the bedside. Libby, our first robot employee, works in the library. She's been at work since May 2019. And she was answering about 800 queries from staff and students. But she works with human beings. All of those environments require different and new skills. And we focus at UP in ensuring that we learn from contexts like COVID, but we learn from rapidly advancing technologies, what others commonly call the 4th Industrial Revolution.
Exceptional. There's so much of stuff that UP is doing, and lovely to hear all the new areas that you're exploring. And especially, I think we wouldn't, as human beings, exploring these opportunities if it wasn't for COVID. So I think, yes, we think of COVID as a negative impacting event, but I think it has brought about a lot of positive events and fast-tracked a lot of things.
Every cloud is a silver lining. And the silver lining in COVID is learning to do things differently that you could have done, but you didn't think you have to do it.
Yeah. True. Excellent. Thank you for that, Professor Kupe. Sizwe, I have a question around critical skills in this country. And I think moving away from the impact of COVID and not just looking at future skills that we need in this country, a lot of them require critical skills. And like Professor Kupe touched on, 4th Industrial Revolution related skills, IT, robotics, data analytics, machine learning, et cetera. And not just in that space, but how do we get universities to align with what the world of work is needing? So where do you see for South Africa, where is that going in terms of us creating that bunch of critical skills that we need in this country, and how prepared are we for that?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that we live in a country where there are major mismatches between the supply of skills and the demand of skills. Let me just give you an example. In a recent survey which was conducted by Harambee, Harambee is an organization, a non-profit organization that creates pathways for young people. They did a survey late last year, in fact this year, which was just testing with employers what their attitudes are in terms of work, in terms of the availability of skills that they require, especially as the world has become more digitized and so on. And it was really surprising and in fact depressing to see that there are companies at the level of about just over 60% who said they outsource a lot of the functionality and expertise and experience which they need, especially when it comes to digital applications and experience and skills and competencies, to countries outside of this country, in a country which sits with the unemployment rate which is more than 60%. And in fact, for young people, the unemployment rate is even higher. So it just shows you that we sit in an environment where we have an education system across the board, and it's really great that universities such as the University of Pretoria that are addressing the issues, that whilst we understand that universities are there to produce knowledge, to create spaces for critical thought, it is at the same time important to understand the context in which that takes place. Because if as a country we continue to just simply provide entry to young people into the higher education system, whether it is community colleges, TVET colleges, or universities, but we increase the number of unemployed graduates that are coming from especially those three post-school systems, it means essentially we're failing a lot of young people in our country. So I think there's a need to address this issue. We have a Human Resources Development Council in this country that was supposed to address this issue of the supply and demand mismatch. But unfortunately, at least I have not experienced and seen that we're making significant headway when it comes to that. And it is important, obviously, that the skills and pervasive competencies that we need to develop of young people, beyond just the knowledge that they're getting, building resilience, making sure that, for instance, we're preparing young people for the world of work, that we create an environment where we're producing a lot more entrepreneurs and people who are job creators, as opposed to people who go to education institutions simply, again, to go and look for a job. I think there's still a major mismatch when it comes to this in our country. And that's why, often when I'm at universities, you're going to find that, for instance, the program quality mix, what is called a PQM, in a lot of institutions, you find that institutions are really good at offering new programs, are not that great in taking things that are not relevant anymore, that are not, really making a contribution and making sure that young people can meaningfully participate. It doesn't mean that, we need to transform universities to vocational institutions, but we have to make sure that we're creating an environment where we can build these skills and competencies for young people, yes, for critical thought, for production of knowledge, consumption of knowledge, and so on, but also, more importantly, for meaningful participation in the economy. So there's a lot that needs to be done in that regard. And that also applies to the basic education system. A lot of us, still remain very, very positive about, for instance, the introduction in basic education of the three-stream curriculum, the technical vocational and the technical occupational curriculum, in addition to what has become the significant part of the basic education curriculum, which is really based on knowledge. So unfortunately, I think that process has been disrupted by COVID, of the introduction of that, especially the two streams of our curriculum, because what we do see and continue to see is a situation where every year there's more or less about 1 million young people, children, who get into the basic education system, but at the exit point, especially at grade 12, means we still continue to lose about 60% of young people, especially in the senior phase and the FET phase. In other words, between grade 8 and grade 12, we lose somewhere in the region of about 600,000 young people. And a lot of them contribute to the statistics of unemployed young people. So there's something that needs to be done about the basic education system, and I'm hopeful that the technical, occupational, and technical vocational curriculum will address that issue. And I would call on all parties to really move that process along so that that curriculum can be embedded in our system. And also just working with all the stakeholders, because very often I think there's still the sense, and it's not only a South African issue, there's a sense that government must sort out education, that people pay their taxes, obviously for government to take a role and play a role in managing, for instance, education as a social sort of enterprise. I think it is important for stakeholders to be a lot more involved. That's why I'm a co-founder of the National Education Collaboration Trust. So we bring organized business, teacher unions, civil society to work and support the basic education department in sorting that out. Similarly with Isfap. Isfap, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, is actually made up of the founding members that are business, organized business as in BLSA, Business Leadership South Africa, the Banking Association, the Association of Savings and Investment, SAICA, and the First Rand Foundation, to address this issue, because we can no longer just leave it to government or public institutions, particularly universities in this case, to address that issue. We need people to hold hands, and that has become even more important in the face of COVID. That it can no longer be a case that government and public institutions are the ones that can address this issue. The gaps that have been elevated and amplified because of COVID require all of us to work together to address the issue. We've seen, for instance, the growth in student debt. The student debt in the university system in South Africa has increased, and particularly in the last couple of years, it's now sitting at above 16 billion rand. And obviously it means that we have a lot of young people who have no means, who owe universities a significant amount of money. So they need some support. They need to find employment. They need to find some support to be able to deal with this growing student debt. We have a lot of young people, obviously, that organizations such as Isfap is supporting, or the National Student Financial Aid is supporting. But the demand for financial support, just at the National Student Financial Aid, as an example, government has done a huge amount of work to increase the allocation of budget to NSFAS, which is now above 35 billion rand a year. But the demand and the need is even greater.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we sustain the higher education system without essentially taking away from, for instance, from research, from the block grants, from earmark grants that are really important for universities, and at the same time support the students in giving them access, success, graduation, so that they can participate in the system. Because at the moment, if we just look at that issue, you look at NSFAS, you look at the budget allocation, you look at the role that organizations such as Isfap are playing, we need a lot more people to come to the party. And we have to accept in our country that we can't just provide grants, which is what obviously the National Student Financial Aid Scheme and Isfap are providing. I think the financial services sector and others need to work together to find other innovative ways of how we can improve the quality of our higher education system, because it is at risk at the moment. We know, for instance, that the government had to take money away from other programs, including the National Skills Fund, to fund students in universities. But that means that we're taking something, it's actually a zero-sum game. So we've got to find new sources of funding to be able to make sure that we're not degrading our education system, particularly our university system, which is still very highly regarded worldwide, but there's a risk that the academic program may be degraded if we're taking money from some of our academic programs and research into funding students. So we have to find ways to be able to grow the size of the cake so that we can provide access. Universities must provide programs that are relevant, take away those things that are not relevant, and improve the success rate of students. That's why, just going back to the stats that you mentioned earlier in your introductory remarks, the fact that Isfap produces occupations and skills in high demand, that we are able to produce a 85% pass rate within regulated time of study, means that students are coming in, they're getting out of the system, they're finding employment, they're making a meaningful participation in the economy, which are all important components that are going to make our country and our economy successful.
Thanks, Iswe. Yeah, that's really, really important and very, very insightful. I do want to touch on student debt, but I think in a bit. But just in terms of funding that you mentioned and funding that government gives to NSFAS, and it's close to about 41, 42 billion rands this year. And probably the need is over 50 billion rands for just to cover the poor household, which is from 0 to 350,000 household incomes. And the missing middle is a whole different segment above that, which is from 350,000 household income to 600,000 household income rands. And that segment needs close to about 26, 28, even 30 billion rands. So where do you see, with government having constrained, budgets and money? Of course, now in the last, pre-budget, we've fairly done much better with mining income coming in and profits doing better on the commodity side. So government and the finance minister has some room to play with funding. But where do you see this large sums of money coming to solve some of these missing middle challenges that we have in this country? And not just that, but even managing to top up for fulfilling the poor student funding need. Where do you think that's going to come? And question to both of you, in fact.
Right. You go ahead.
Yeah, so we must be clear that the government is not funding the missing middle.
Yes.
In fact, as we see it now, this year it was a struggle to
even
make
fund
the
poor
commitments which have been made to the NEFSA students. I think there was a shortfall of 6.5 billion.
Correct.
And that was achieved by cutting the budgets of the universities. And some of that money was going to the grants that Ms. Ikusasa was talking about, including research, because it's very, very important to strike the right balances. You can't also teach in a research-poor environment. That affects the quality of what is taught. It is not actually, in a sense, keeping up with trends. That is why at the University of Pretoria, we do what we call inquiry-led teaching. So the missing middle is unfunded. And that is what the beauty of Isfap is. Isfap has stepped into that breach, if you like. But Isfap alone cannot carry the entirety of what is missing excuse the tautology, missing for the missing middle, if you like. And so, and this is very hard. If the economy does not grow, if we do not have all of the structural reforms necessary, we might have mining income to bridge us for the time being, but we need the whole economy functioning in a way in which there is substantive economic growth, there is substantive employment, and also to bridge those and for people to be able to. As we speak now, COVID has resulted in the missing middle increasing in numbers, right? So the 600 threshold is now too low. Perhaps it should actually be much higher. But you're talking about people who are unemployed now and unable to pay fees, who previously were able to pay fees, or who previously, even as missing middle, some might have Isfap, some might not, they might manage through loans, and so they can't manage that anymore. So we're getting into a very big crisis, which requires really a thinking out of the box, which has to be, as Mrs. Ikusasa said, a partnership across many stakeholders, but fundamentally actually getting an economy that is growing and that serves the population.
Yeah, just a couple of points there, and I agree with Professor Cooper that we need all stakeholders working together. The issue of the missing middle is a big issue. The 26 to 30 billion rand need that you talked about cannot be addressed by government alone, especially given the 6 or so billion rand gap in the funding of the National Student Financial Aid qualifying students. So essentially you need a more sustainable solution across the board. And that solution is going to require a number of things. If you look at the rest of the world, social impact investing, as an example, has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry in the rest of the world. In South Africa, it's still extremely small. And in fact, we'll need a number of changes in policy, in legislation and regulations to make social impact investing a really meaningful and viable source of funding in our country. Because at the moment, as it currently stands, pension funds, retirement funds, other investors, including the banks, can't really meaningfully invest in social impact investing. And what do I mean by social impact investing? I mean an environment where there are investors. If you look at the production of skills, it's an investment actually. And you should be able to attract a lot of money which can get some return. It may be return in terms of people who are earning an income later on, who are finding employment and so on, but there's some return for those people who are investing in the creation and the production of those skills. Other countries are doing it quite successfully. It will require some changes in policy, legislation, and regulations for that to happen, as an example. So that would open another stream of income as opposed to grants and loans. Because at the moment, those are the only two options that are available. Because if you look at loans, bank loans that are given to students in this country, as an example, they still require parents or households to provide collateral. So you can't really, yes, there have been a couple of smaller pilots that are being run.
Are our banks too risk averse, though, in South Africa?
Well,
what
the
is the
issue is
proportion
this:
of
banks and retirement funds
do not, and trustees of banks and shareholders do not have a mandate to lose money. So that's why, if you look at our prudential regulations as an example, they require some collateral. If a loan is regarded as unsecured, if it's regarded as unsecured, there are certain regulations that are quite punitive to the banks that grant those loans. So actually it makes them economically unviable to do so under the current regime. So there'll have to be some, if you look at the rest of the world, where student loans are granted, including the US, which is sitting with more than $1 trillion of loans, there is always government support. There's always government guarantees
Backing those loans.
that backs those loans. In our country, because of our fiscal as well as position of our balance sheet as a country, we know that the capacity of the national treasury to provide those guarantees is very limited. So that's why you need other stakeholders to come to the party. South Africa is not short of pools of funding, but there are certain things that, in fact, even talk to just the structure of our economy, the ownership patterns in our economy, that would have to be addressed over time to create more and new pools of funding that will, both domestic as well as internationally, that will make it possible for us to start to fundamentally address some of the issues that we're talking about here today.
Yeah, yeah. But if I'm a child coming from a missing middle household, let alone a poor household, I have no collateral to give to the bank. How can I access the whole financial system to get funding?
So that's
if
why
I want to pay it back.
The couple of things that would make it possible is not only addressing policy, legislation, and regulations. It's also addressing the kind of, going back to our earlier discussion around the supply and the demand of skills in the country. To the extent that the system starts to produce more skills that lead to better employability, and at the same time addresses some of the inhibitors or barriers to economic growth, and they are very well documented in this country, including the reforms that are required to be done, whether it's state-owned companies or sectors of our economy and so on. All of these things talk together, because all of them would lead to better economic growth if there was political will, as well as the will from a lot of other stakeholders. Because what we have in South Africa is a situation where we have big government, big labor, and big business. We crowd out, for instance, SMMEs. SMMEs and the private sector can play a really important role if we created a better enabling environment to address that, which would lead to the production of skills for people to become entrepreneurs, for funders, whether the venture capital funds or angel investors, to have a really big ecosystem. Other countries have done it very successfully, including a few countries in the continent that started way after we became a democratic country and are making headway when it comes to the production of skills. I can talk, for instance, of Rwanda as an example. You see just how they're attracting education institutions, technology companies into that environment. And they're really meaningfully dealing with the 4IR. And I think we do a lot of talking about SMMEs, about 4IR in this country. And there are a lot of things structurally that we have to do to address it so that we can create more hope, more opportunities for young people. So it can be done.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I think entrepreneurship, like you mentioned, is one way. I have just some stats that says 33%, which is nearly 1/3 of students coming out of the education system want to become entrepreneurs and are doing already one hustle on the side. There's about 12% of students that are doing 3 hustles because they don't know whether they're going to get jobs or not. Another stat says that 55% of students don't know whether they're going to get employed or not. And that's stats as of last month. This was a survey done by PPS earlier this month. And it's startling, facts that students just don't have any faith in the system, whether they're going to get jobs. So it feels like we're giving them hope to study, but we need to do much more as a country to give them employment.
Yeah, so that is why if you see at the University of Pretoria, every student can take a free online entrepreneurship course. It's free to everybody, it's online. And this is not because of COVID. It was there before COVID. Then we have our Ready to Work program, because we have an understanding that for those who get employment, it doesn't follow they want to be employed all their life, or should be employed all their life, or will find employment through their life. Some might have lost jobs during COVID. That's why we need that buffer as well. So we have the Ready for Work program. I think that's ended as the award last week. We have a free online course, and we have tax innovation and incubator. And now yesterday we started our launch of the Future of Work, which will influence also our curriculum to say what are the skills of the future and how are they reflected in the curriculum. Because it's all very well to talk about the future of work, but the doctor is not actually in a sense examining themselves. So our Future of Work, one of its work streams is to look at our own curriculums in relation to the current job market as it is changing, and also to then buffer it with free online courses, ready for work programs, and lifelong learning courses, if you like. So we're going to look at micro-credentials. Post a degree, you might actually not want another degree. You might want some micro-credentials because of the new opportunities that are arising. So there's also, it's not just economic reforms that are needed in the country. It's educational reforms are needed, which articulate everything from early childhood development all the way to the tertiary system. Because that's one of the problems in South Africa, is that our education system is disjointed. Everyone wants to finish matric and go to university. You won't find that in Germany.
Yeah.
You first perhaps go to a technical college, or what we call a TVET here. Then you go and work, if you like. And that technical college is connected to an employee learnership environment, internship environment. And then afterwards, after 5 years of work, you might actually then want a university degree. But it's connected to skills that are actually needed. So that's how the lifelong work. Here we have a congested system where too many people are at university when they are not actually ready for university, or that is not what is going to give them a livelihood. And so throughput rates and related things, not just financial, it's also actually people's attitude and readiness for certain levels of skilling, education, and so on.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point you make. I think not everybody needs to come to university, and we can actually spread them across different learning institutions.
Especially immediately after matric.
Absolutely, yeah. And I love the German model that you spoke about. They call it the dual system of education, where you actually study and you learn and you work and implement what you learn for half the time that you study, which is excellent. I want to quickly talk about the missing middle in particular now, and at UP in particular. How has COVID impacted the missing middle? Has that size grown? And what is the value proposition for the missing middle that UP has?
No, definitely. I think what COVID has done, as I said earlier on, is to increase the number of people that are in the missing middle. So let me put it this way. Typically, before COVID, 20% of our students, or just under 20%, 19%, qualified for NEFSAS, the 350,000 threshold. Our calculations, because the missing middle, as you know, is very fluid, it's very hard to determine. The parameters we have are useful to work with. Let's say 60% of our students were missing middle. 20% are those, I say, could pay for themselves without, for some of them, without selling the family Maserati or going to holiday.
So that's a massive chunk, 60%.
Yeah. But among some of those people have fallen into the missing middle, right? So the missing middle, and also people in the missing middle who could, yes, with some difficulty, still pay. Now you find they are defaulting, or they cannot pay their fees in full. So what people in the missing middle used to do is they would pay over the year, and at the end of the year, they've actually paid the fees they do. Now they are not able to do that. So we have seen the increase in student debt, the point you spoke about earlier on. Our student debt is rising every year more than it did in the past, because people were able to make a plan, but people have actually, in a sense, lost jobs with the shrinking economy and the economy that is not actually growing. That actually then also has a serious impact on the university. And also with grants being cut on the government side, I have less budget than I would need. And also some companies where I could fundraise, because also it's just in our environment as well. A university vice chancellor cannot depend on fees and government grants alone. You also got to go out to market and fundraise. And before COVID, we were doing very well. In some areas, we have not been impacted too negatively. Some people came to the party. With the computers, for example, we were stunned that companies came to the party. And for some research, COVID-related or health-related, environment-related, the planet crisis and so on, some research funding is coming. But it's not, it's a difficult balancing act, if you like, where we need greater stability for sustainability, if you like.
Yeah. And you talked about goals and sustainability. I think social development goals, SDG, and the plans around that, and education is a big part of that. And I think it's very important element of. And I think we kind of forget with what's happening with COVID and that we can neglect education. But I think it's still the biggest spend from corporate CSI programs in terms of education in this country. So it is still very, very important for South Africa at least.
The research unit and the people that are going to deal with the impacts of COVID often will be produced from the university as well. Where do you get your doctors from? Where do you get your research to develop vaccines and all of that and other care? People now talk about long COVID. That's not COVID itself, but the disease impact of COVID on people will need lots of care, right?
Yeah. Excellent. I just want to remind our attendees to please send in your Q&A, your questions either in the live chat or in the Q&A box. And in about 10 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes or so, we would take a few questions from some of them. All right. So now that we've talked about the missing middle, and we're trying to find solutions, like you mentioned, Mr. Nksana, about how does private and public sector come together? What else is required other than public-private partnerships? You talked about the ecosystem, you talked about curriculum, you talked about employability, you talked about growth and economy doing better and giving opportunities to the youth in this country, giving them hope. How do we bring all this together? Because government doesn't seem to be moving fast enough. And private sector is reluctant to put their money where the mouth is because they're also reluctant to see where the country is going, where we're progressing, whether the reforms are coming, etc., etc. So are we in a flux? And we're not putting money behind these social causes that we need in this country. And what's required for us to take this forward?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. You made reference to the SDGs. If you look at SDG 4, particularly which makes reference to access and equity in education, and Professor Kupe talked about, no young person being left behind, it is important and it is actually possible that by partners working together, we can start addressing some of these fundamental issues. Whether they are curriculum and what is taught at schools and at universities is important. The issue of addressing community colleges and TVET colleges is really important. I get very concerned when I hear proposals such as, yes, of course, we've looked at the German model and centers of excellence, and there were a couple of them that were being created in the country to connect trade associations to the TVET colleges and so on. But then when you hear universities are also being asked to sort of develop curriculum for TVET colleges, for me that seems to be an anomaly and a contradiction, because I think we should be pulling places of work or trade associations and the private sector to work with TVET colleges to really address these issues of centers of excellence. If I look at the curriculum that is offered in community colleges and TVET colleges, it really needs a lot to be desired. So we have more than 1 million young people who are going to TVET colleges where they're doing admin and HR. And we know these days, with technology and all of this, large employers don't need big HR departments anymore. You don't need that anymore because technology has taken a lot of those roles and admin roles that were previously played by a whole battery of people sitting in HR offices. And things like marketing and admin. Business doesn't need a lot of admin people today. We rather need people who are adept and experienced and trained in technology and how to use technology as an example in a whole range of different areas in technology. From people, if you look at, for instance, the kind of employment that's been created out of social media as an example, out of, whether it's, these hailing platforms that are now around, means that we need people who understand the whole value chain of technology, who are able to produce skills. The fact that I've mentioned, more than 60% of the companies mentioned that they outsource some of the skills. We could be creating these skills here in our country. So the number of things that require to be addressed, how do you address the basic education system is really important. We have a crisis in mathematics in this country. We have a real crisis. Last year, in 2020, we had more than 680,000 young people who wrote, matric, grade 12. But out of those, only about 122,000 were registered for mathematics. The balance were registered for maths literacy. And in fact, the numbers of young people who are registered for mathematics is declining. So we can't talk about young people participating in the fourth industrial revolution when you don't have the skills in mathematical and statistical sciences that are going to be able to pursue those skills and competencies in those areas. So there's a number of these structural issues that we can address, and they all fall within the realm of decisions that have to be taken by our government, by our civil society, by universities, working with the private sector in addressing some of these fundamental flaws so that we can address them. So the issue is, how do we give hope to young people that they have a future, that they have a bright future to make something out of their lives? And the tools are all within a lot of us who are in the system. Isfap is doing its bit. The NECT, National Education Collaboration Trust, is doing its bit. Universities such as UP are doing their bit. But very often, we all work in different spaces and we're not collaborating appropriately and adequately as we should to address some of these fundamental, systemic and structural issues that are going to open and create a lot more pathways for a lot of our young people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you hit it on the head with a lot of those key pointers in terms of just participation from government, just the syllabus you talked about, the curriculum, maths, statistics. I know we struggle to get students from good maths and science because we focus on critical skills. We need to make sure that they come with good maths and science skills and marks, and we struggle to find good students, with that need to come with that background. And I don't know what the stats is. I know you mentioned it last time, Sizwe, in terms of just how bad our maths, literacy rates are in this country. And I know you work very, closely in the basic education space. So you have information around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is really a real issue because out of that 122,000 that I mentioned that wrote mathematics, if you just look at those that pass mathematics with 50% plus, the numbers drop to just over 40,000. And if it's 60% plus, the numbers are even lower. Yes. And obviously we know that for young people to get accepted, especially into the STEM subjects, into science, into technology, engineering, mathematical sciences, and so on, you require at least 60%. So if this country is depending on very low numbers, we're talking now, sort of in a couple of tens of thousands. Essentially, it means we can't produce the skills in adequate numbers that we need in some of those areas that are going to be really important. And they are the future of work.
Because to do things like data sciences, you need to be very strong in mathematics. 50% or 60 won't do it.
Doesn't cut it.
Yes. A colleague of mine said that if we needed those students, might just be 10,000 from the system. We perform very highly mathematics in order to be able to do very complex computing, data sciences, sophisticated.
And I would imagine the university's success is really dependent on the pipeline that comes into the universities. Because if you have garbage in, you get garbage out.
So to maintain my 54-55% in science, engineering, and technology, and those students need the strong mathematics. They don't need 50%.
So do you do some kind of a bridging program before they get into the system, particularly in those degrees, or how does UP cope
so
with
for
those
example, at our Memo Lady campus, we run some of our foundation programs to bridge that gap. But often that is rather too late. But again, it's diverting resources into fixing a problem that happened lower below. And you can't afford that. That is why next year we want to launch a pre-university academy, which is again a partnership model where we work with schools to develop a curriculum that can be strengthened and taught much earlier in the system. The intervention, the ambulance approach, where a person has already failed at matric and try and push them through additional teaching. It's time-intensive, resource-intensive, but also you're diverting from your mandate and your role.
Yeah.
So we need to fix, as I said, holistically the entire system.
Yeah. All right. I want to quickly, we're running out of time before we start taking questions. So please put in your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, and I'll have a view of it here when I moderate them. Just a quick touch on student debt. And I know, Sizwe, you mentioned about it, and it's edging closer to the 16, 17 billion rands. And that's a lot. And that's just probably student debt from universities, I would imagine, and not other institutions. So how do you deal with this? How is UP dealing with something like this?
Well, the way to deal with it, we need to be paid the debt, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But of course,
but you can't keep giving.
Yeah, yes, because you can't keep on writing off amounts owing. This will become, you become insolvent at some point. But also, remember that money that you are owed is money that you could use to keep the quality to improve on the quality. Because quality is not something that is statistic. The world changes. We're talking about a changing environment, 4IR, new jobs, the future of work. Those require investment. Remember the 100 million I spoke about, which enabled us to be better able to negotiate the COVID situation. We need to be putting more money into our laboratories, our systems, our learning and management systems to offer the kind of competitive higher education environment. Because here we're talking here as if almost someone listening to us must say they talk as if South Africa is an island.
Yeah.
We're competing with the rest of the world. We are no longer the isolated nation of apartheid pre-94.
Yeah.
We are now on a global. Mr. Kasanya spoke about Rwanda. We'll be competing with Rwanda as well, competing with Nigeria, we should be competing with Singapore. Otherwise, we'll be left behind.
Yeah.
So debt really is a distress, not only to those who owe debt because they can't pay, but it's a distress to the university and the higher education system. So the best you can do is try and collect, but you also know you're trying to collect from somebody who genuinely cannot pay. So one of the things that is actually also needed is a fundamental reform of the funding system, and a mixed system is necessary. Government will never be able to pay for everybody when it is already struggling with NEFSAs. Even in the best of times, by the way, it's not sustainable to have one source of funding. As Mr. Nkosana said, there must be multiple modes of funding, but that are so well articulated. They take care of the financial health of the system and produce the skills that the country actually needs.
Yep. And Mr. Nkosana, how do we structurally solve this problem?
Yeah, just a couple of things, a couple of thoughts there. So the problem has to be approached from a multi-pronged approach. In other words, our discussion around fixing the basic education system is relevant in terms of student funding at the end of the day. The issue of sorting out community colleges and TVET colleges is relevant because not everybody must feel like they need to go to university, and that's their only option, which is sort of the case at the moment. And just going back to the issue of students that are funded out of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, the missing middle, and those that whose parents are able to pay. Someone has to pay across all of these three categories, because even NSFAS is taxpayers' monies at the end of the day. And just talking about that in the context of the bulge and the growth in the students that are in that system, is that obviously we know that the 350,000 Rand household income upper threshold for NSFAS was announced in 2018. That 350,000 Rand is now about 280,000 Rand. Yep. What does that mean? It means that if you were a parent, maybe you're a school teacher, you work for government, and you were earning, let's say, about 320,000 Rand in 2018, today, if you factor for inflation at about 4.5% or thereabouts, that amount is equivalent to about 280,000 Rand now. Yeah. It means you no longer qualify for NSFAS, you are now in the missing middle. So that number continues to shift. So we're adding more. So that 26 to 30 billion Rand that you indicated is an old number. That number is actually even higher today. So that's why we have to find, even for the missing middle, Isfap, we still continue to fund students between 350,000 Rand and 650,000 Rand or 600,000 Rand. That number has not factored inflation. So essentially, you have people who are joining the ranks of the missing middle,
and people who are thrown out of the missing middle, but it doesn't mean they can afford to pay.
Yeah.
And that increases the student debt that we see in the system. So we do absolutely need a more comprehensive approach to addressing the issue that we're talking about here today. We can't just say we're going to keep writing checks without fundamentally addressing some of the systemic and structural issues that sit in our system. That should be producing skills for people to become entrepreneurs, support SMMEs, create a whole ecosystem around venture capital and angel investors, social impact investors. And all of these solutions are going to go towards addressing our fundamental issues about how do we produce human resources in our country that are going to sustain economic growth over a long time.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. Thanks, Mr. Nksana. I think I'm going to take a few quick questions. I know we're running out of time. It's 1:15, and we want to close on time at 1:30. We have a question here. How is the university and Isfap making graduates more employable? And I think I'll just maybe answer quickly for Isfap, and then Professor Kupe, you can answer it for how universities are making graduates more employable. I think from an Isfap point of view, we really work with students on the ground to give them the necessary skills that they need, whether it's work readiness, whether it is CV writing, whether it is soft skills, hard skills that you spoke about earlier, in making sure that they've got the skills to be able to apply, but also to make sure that they have the confidence to apply and use their skills. So I think that's one. The second thing is we obviously work very closely with our funders and our partners to see the funders and partners and donors that funded these students, whether they can be taken as interns or graduate employees, et cetera, et cetera. And the other opportunities, if that particular funder didn't employ the student that they funded, then the student is opened up to the pool of 50-odd, 60-odd funders, and they could actually go to any of those funders that are in that pool. So I think that's some of the mechanisms that we use, but I want to open it up to Professor Kupe as well.
Yeah, so I think that getting that Isfap loan and accessing Isfap, thanks to his visionary activity in granting this scheme, already lifts a big worry from a student. It's one thing to do well in matric, to be accepted, but not having the means to study is the dream that Isfap through Mr. Nkosana's thoughtful actions has covered. Then a student now has to access what? Quality education, the one that, as Mr. Nkosana said, that is relevant. So, for example, what we then do at the University of Pretoria, quality is important for us. We don't compromise on that. In some of those disciplines that are really professional and directly connected to specific professions, we also have industry advisory boards, which actually make an input into the curriculum. And also then we link the students with the learning internship opportunities. But also we teach them in an environment where there are world-class facilities so that which are relevant to actually delivering you into a work environment. That is why last week we won, I think, that award from the Graduate Employers Association of South Africa for the university that prepares students for work readiness. But it was a partnership between Isfap and the University of Pretoria. We did what we had to do in terms of the quality of the education and the facilities where you are taught, but Isfap came along to actually fund that student for us, who we could not on our own actually fund for ourselves. These are the partnerships. Then we had the employers inputting into the curriculum, mentoring students, and being on our industry or professional advisory boards. We run some other quality assurance, both internal as well as external evaluations. Our students are examined by peers who are not University of Pretoria academics as well. And that is the kind of education system you want for the investment to have a meaning for the individual student and for society and for the economy.
Sure. Thank you. There's a question here which I think is 60% for UP, because 60% of students fall in the missing middle. But what proportion of registered missing middle students is Isfap currently funding? And overall and OR of those that apply for funding. So just to give you an example, Isfap has funded about 2,300 odd students over the last 5 years. So it's approximately 500 students a year. But if you look at the demand-supply gap, there's a massive demand-supply gap. In our first year of operation, we had more funding than students. and now we've obviously got more students and funding. So just to give you an example, we had over 23,000 applications in 2020, and we could only fund 450 students. So there's a massive demand-supply gap in terms of students that need funding versus funds available from funders and donors that we can actually use to support these students.
I can say that UP is one of the big uptakers of Isfap. So I'm looking at the figures here. So for economic and management sciences, 237 students, 18.2 million have been funded. Engineering, built environment, IT, 390 students, 29.5 million. Health sciences, 18.3, 190 students. Natural and agricultural sciences, that will be data, mathematical sciences, actuarial sciences, 76 students, 6.4 million. So I think we easily, the university that, has accessed IPSAP very effectively.
And the main reason for that is exactly the point that actually got the University of Pretoria to win the award. It's about, how do we produce the priority skills, the scarce skills of the country, and how do we match supply and demand?
Yeah.
And that's really what it's about. So the more institutions are able to do that, the easier it is to go and raise funding to be able to fund students. Because when you look at it, without that, if you're just funding students for the sake of it, but they end up as unemployed graduates, we're not going to address that problem.
I'm going to direct this next question to you, Mr. Nksana, because you've been the ex-chairman of NSFAS. They say they make a cheeky remark saying Isfap has an 85% ROI. What do you think is the ROI on NSFAS with their 41 billion rand spend?
Well, I haven't checked the numbers recently because it has to do with how you define throughput pass rates. Do you take the regulated time of study, or do you add the N+2, which is sort of been the NSFAS formula up to now? But generally, that number is sitting, as far as I'm concerned, somewhere around 50 or maybe close to 60% in terms of the ROI. If you add the N+2, in other words, you take the regulated time of study, you add about 2 years on top of that for students to complete the course. And of course, when you look at it, to the extent that the system of university in South Africa sits with a lot of students who are spending 8-9 years doing an undergrad, means there's a cost to the taxpayer, there's a cost to the system, because the universities must still provide spaces, accommodation, lecturers, lecture halls for all of those students. So the issue of throughput pass rates is a very important one, which is why Isfap is not only about financial aid, it is also about how do we make sure we provide additional academic support, working in partnership with universities, psychosocial support, which has become even more important in the context of COVID. Yeah. Because mental health issues are a big issue that may or may not stop university students from graduating. So providing all of that gives us the 85% ROI, whereas NSFAS only really provides financial aid. And it's expected that universities are going to, out of their own resources which are being reduced, provide the psychosocial support as well as additional academic support because of the gaps that students come with.
Very quick question on basic education. Mr. Nksana, if I can quickly read it. Our Department of Basic Education has reduced the passing mark to 30%. How does this impact, and can this be amended because extended curriculum programs at universities are now fashionable?
Yeah, let me just make a point here, that 30% was there under apartheid. It's not a new thing. So, and you must understand the categories of passes. I think maybe the Department of Basic Education needs to do a better job of communicating, because to get a bachelor's pass, obviously you've got to get more than 30%. And those are people who end up at universities. I must say this, that obviously we all know that the rest of the world has had to moderate pass marks because of COVID. The learning losses that we sit with in our country, and as well as the rest of the world, because of COVID, in our country in certain cases is more than 80%. So what's actually happening is that we are going to see those learning losses and the gaps, sort of show themselves up as students come with bachelor's passes
in the university system, but actually the fundamental principles that the students need in whatever programs they end up in at universities are actually quite huge. And universities have to play a role in other bridging programs, supplementary programs, and all of this
Which they don't have funds
to close those gaps. And obviously, there's a cost to all of that.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm really concerned about the quality of the South African university academic program if research grants, earmark grants, and generally block grants are being cut, because it essentially means that we have a system which we may be weakening in terms of the quality that it has enjoyed up to now. So what we need to look at is how to address equity, in other words, access and quality, which is what Professor Kupe was talking about. Because if we compromise on quality, essentially we're saying the quality of academic program, especially at university level, is essentially going to be going south.
And that will have an impact on society.
Yeah, and that mismatch between what work needs, what the world of work needs versus what we're producing is going to be further away.
Yeah.
That mismatch.
But I mean, if you don't produce quality graduates, you can't expect them then to do the work that is needed.
Absolutely.
And also you can't expect to be competitive, because you are not alone in the game.
Yeah.
And this you can't crook.
Yeah.
People will know you do not have high quality engineers. You have collapsing bridges and buildings and all of that.
Yeah.
And people die.
And people die.
And people die. I have a quick question that I'm going to address to both of you, and maybe just 30 seconds on that. You speak about the importance of funding the missing middle, which is wonderful, but are you aware that the issues students have to face? Holding down 2 part-time jobs while completing a full-time degree is very stressful. I'm sure this is from a student. Not to mention the impact it has on marks owing to lack of time to study. This is a serious issue, and that needs to be addressed. How does the panelists feel about that?
So you know, on these issues, we must really be sometimes very careful about this. It's not unusual across the world for people to actually supplement the fees they have by having a job or two. What is a problem, though, is when a student is wholly dependent for their fees and food on having to do multiple jobs. They are created as a negative impact. Isfap has come. That is why Isfap exists as well, to make sure the middle, as your video said at the beginning, that the student can pay their tuition fees, has sufficient food, and money to buy the materials to study, a laptop, books, textbooks, and all of that. It's important that the time of a student is spent mostly on studying, but it is not wrong for a student to have regulated part-time job in order to supplement their income.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor Kupe. A cheeky question from a student as well, I think. Will you allow graduates who have got debt to get their certificates so that they at least can get jobs?
So there is a system in place where a student's results can be communicated to employers so that they get jobs. But remember also debt, university has to have something in order to secure the payback. But what will be wrong is for students totally to be blocked from finding employment in order to be able to pay the university, but their results being totally withheld.
Yeah. Last question to Mr. Ikusasa, and then we can quickly wrap up, and I'm going to give 2 minutes to each of the panelists to just summarize on the topic that we've discussed today. So just a quick question on what is the importance of increasing throughput rates and thereby reducing the leakage throughout the system by utilizing support ecosystems that can particularly help graduates that are first-time university entrants?
Well, it's particularly important for a number of reasons. For starters, it means that the places that are available at universities can be released quickly for a lot of those that are coming through the basic education system to also have seats. Because in this country, we have enrollment targets that are approved by the Department of Education and Training. So universities are disincentivized. In fact, they get penalized if they over-enroll. So how do we get young people into the system with relevant degrees, throughput pass rates out of the system into the economy? That's really the key issue that has to be addressed. That's why Isfap has an ROI of 85%, because that's exactly what we ensure that we do. So we fund full cost of study, we provide support, students come into the system in relevant degrees, critical skills out of the system into the economy.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Nksana. And I know we've got our ticker down on the website, or you'll find that information. You can go to Isfap, the Isfap website, or UP's website to reach out to us and get more information about us. We would like to quickly give the panelists 2 minutes each to just conclude the day and the topic that we've discussed today. If I can start with you, Professor Kupe.
No, so just to add to what Mr. Nkosana said, universities and particularly at UP, we run something called Fly at UP. It's not an airline. It's not like SA. It means fly. The finish line is yours. That is about finishing in time. So it's a support mechanism to help to identify and help those students who might be struggling so they finish in time. Then there are wraparound programs where students are given what they need. Some of it is not exactly financial, it's emotional and other forms of support, food parcels, for example, for those without food. But it must be said, let me repeat myself here in conclusion. We need urgent reforms in the ecosystem of funding students in the best interests of a sustainable and a better country and a better life for all. We all know that a university degree enables social mobility and takes people out of poverty, and there's an impact not just on the economy, but on a greater family, a greater number of family members. And education is still the only way. Show me a country where the people were uneducated and unskilled, and it was a successful and sustainable country. There is none, and there's a good reason for that. So funding education is the sustainability of our society.
Excellent, well put, thank you.
Yeah, the point that I just want to make is that, having started Isfap it's about 5 years ago now, we have a model that works. We have a model where we have various partners, business, organized business particularly, who are the founding members of Isfap. We can always have a lot more partners with an ROI of 85%, working with institutions, in other words, with universities, with government. We can really, do a whole lot in solving the problem of not just funding the missing middle, because there are elements in the funding model of Isfap that we really believe are applicable in finding a sustainable solution for the problem that we have in our country. We have a number of other pilots that we are starting to look at, such as, for instance, how do we provide loans, working with financial institutions so that we can fund more students. We have pilots around social impact investing that we're going to be starting. So we have solutions that can work in addressing the fundamental issues that we're facing and that we have been discussing here today. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, thank you. This recording will be available to all participants and will be emailed to you latest by tomorrow. We really appreciate your time in attending this live dialogue today. Really thankful to both you gentlemen, Mr. Nksana and Mr. Kupe. Really appreciate your time and taking in making this happen. Thank you very much.
And thank you to Isfap. Long live Isfap.
Thank you, Prof.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Prof.
Tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. A seed planted today takes root and grows into a tree that bears fruit in the future. Over 110 years ago, a seed was planted. Today, that seed, the idea of excellence, has grown into the University of Pretoria, South Africa's largest contact research-intensive university. 9 faculties and a business school are spread across 7 beautiful campuses, which are home to over 50,000 students, ready to make an impact in the world beyond university and join our global network of nearly 300,000 alumni. Future-focused, sustainably developed facilities and cutting-edge multi- and transdisciplinary research are underpinned by a desire to transform lives and have a positive impact on communities and the world. Excellence in teaching, learning, research innovation, arts and culture, and sports puts us firmly amongst the world's best universities. Knowledge is not just what is in books. It is the wisdom to apply it, to nourish and nurture the seed so that it takes root, grows tall, bears fruit, and branches out. UP plants that seed, that tiny bit of curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, hope, the desire to care, respect, help, and innovate against all odds, to grow, to leave your mark, to excel, to challenge the norm, to think, to rethink, to discover, to inquire, to lead, to have courage, to make a difference, and to persevere. This is the University of Pretoria. We make today and every day matter.